In the spring of 1961, the United States suffered one of its most humiliating defeats in the Cold War. On April 17, Brigade 2506, a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles, landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast, expecting a popular uprising against Fidel Castro. Within 72 hours, the invasion collapsed. More than 1,000 men were captured. The United States stood exposed as the sponsor, and President John F. Kennedy was left furious and politically vulnerable. Publicly, the administration projected calm resolve. Kennedy accepted responsibility for the failure while insisting America would pursue peaceful diplomatic pressure on Castro's regime. Behind closed doors, however, the mood inside the Pentagon and intelligence community was one of raw frustration and determination. The Cuba problem had to be solved, and it had to be solved soon. In November 1961, Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a multi-agency covert program run out of the White House and coordinated by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Its stated goal was to undermine and ultimately remove the Castro government through sabotage, propaganda, and support for internal resistance. On paper, Mongoose was aggressive but still within the bounds of covert action. In practice, it became the incubator for ideas far more extreme. By early 1962, senior military officers had grown impatient with what they saw as half measures. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Army General Lyman Lemnitzer, believed that limited covert operations would never be enough. They wanted a clear path to full-scale invasion and the removal of Castro by force. The only obstacle was the American public and international opinion. Both were still wary of another direct confrontation after the Bay of Pigs disaster. The military solution was as cold as it was procedural: create the justification for war by manufacturing it themselves. Throughout February and early March 1962, staff officers under the direction of the Joint Chiefs drafted a detailed memorandum titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The document carried the highest classification, top secret. It was not a theoretical exercise. It was a formal proposal presented through the chain of command to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The public narrative remained unchanged. Americans were told their government was exercising patience and exploring every diplomatic avenue. Castro was portrayed as a dangerous but containable threat. No one outside a tiny circle of generals and Pentagon planners had any idea that the nation's highest military authorities were actively designing operations that would deliberately kill American citizens and soldiers, then blame those deaths on Cuba. This was the environment in which Operation Northwoods was born. Not as rogue fantasy, but as an official signed recommendation from every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The plan would remain locked in classified vaults for 35 years. The stage was now set. The machinery of deception had moved from concept to concrete memorandum, and on March 13, 1962, that memorandum would be placed on Secretary McNamara's desk, bearing the signatures of America's entire top military command. On March 13, 1962, a 15-page top-secret memorandum landed on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its formal title was Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It carried the unanimous approval of every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by Chairman General Lyman L. Lemnitzer. The document did not mince words. It opened with the blunt assessment that the United States could no longer tolerate the Castro regime, and that a full military invasion was the only reliable solution. The problem, the general stated, was justification. The American public and the international community would not support direct intervention without a clear provocation. Therefore, the United States should create that provocation itself. What followed was a coldly procedural catalog of false flag operations, each designed to appear as unprovoked Cuban aggression. The memorandum laid them out with military precision, complete with suggested timelines, expected casualties, and propaganda strategies. One proposal called for a Remember the Main incident. American forces would stage an attack on Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, making it look like Cuban troops had launched the assault. Casualties among U.S. military personnel would be real or fabricated as needed. The incident would be used to generate immediate outrage and calls for retaliation. Another set of plans focused on aviation. The military would hijack or simulate the hijacking of a civilian airliner. In one scenario, a U.S. passenger plane would be swapped mid-flight with a drone aircraft painted to look identical. The real plane would land safely at a secret base while the drone was destroyed over Cuban waters, broadcasting a fabricated distress call blaming Cuban fighters. The memo even suggested staging funerals for mock victims to maximize emotional impact on the American public. Additional proposals included sinking a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Harbor and blaming Cuban patrol boats, staging terrorist attacks inside major U.S. cities, Miami, for example, with bombs and evidence planted to implicate Castro agents, attacking Cuban refugees in Florida and blaming the Cuban government, blowing up ammunition stores at Guantanamo and framing Cuban saboteurs, creating a wave of anti-American violence in countries throughout Latin America manufactured by CIA assets but attributed to Cuban operatives. The document emphasized the need for rapid execution. It recommended that the provocations occur within a compressed time frame so the narrative could not be challenged before the invasion began. Every detail was engineered for maximum psychological effect. Graphic imagery for the press, prepared statements for the United Nations, and pre-written justifications for Congress. The language throughout remained bureaucratic and restrained. There was no emotional rhetoric, only the procedural logic of military necessity. Killing American citizens and soldiers was presented as an acceptable cost of creating the required casus belli. The memo explicitly stated that the Declassified result was a justification so compelling that the United States would appear to be the victim responding in self-defense. This was not speculation or contingency planning in the abstract. It was a formal recommendation from the highest military body in the United States, signed and forwarded through the chain of command. The Joint Chiefs were not suggesting these ideas as possibilities. They were presenting them as the recommended course of action. At the time, the American public knew none of this. The newspapers spoke of diplomatic efforts, naval patrols in the Caribbean, and the continuing threat of communism 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy's administration publicly stressed caution and restraint after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment. The contrast between the public posture and the classified reality could not have been more complete. The March 13 memorandum represented the apex of a particular Cold War mindset. The belief that deception of the American people was not only permissible but necessary when the stakes involved national security. The generals who signed it were not fringe extremists. They were the most decorated, respected officers in the armed forces. The document now sat on McNamara's desk awaiting decision. How the civilian leadership would respond would determine whether these proposals remained theoretical exercises or became operational reality. The machinery had produced its recommendation. The next move belonged to the Secretary of Defense and the President. The March 13 memorandum did not stop at general concepts. It descended into precise operational detail, listing specific false flag scenarios with the clinical detachment of a military planning document. The aviation proposals were among the most elaborate. One called for the creation of an exact duplicate of a civilian airliner. A U.S.-registered passenger plane would be loaded with passengers, or appear to be, then swapped in flight with a remotely controlled drone aircraft. The real plane would divert to a secure military base, while the drone continued toward Cuba. Over Cuban airspace or international waters, the drone would be destroyed by simulated Cuban fighters or surface-to-air missiles. A pre-recorded distress call would broadcast that the aircraft was under attack by Cuban MiGs. The memo noted that casualties could be staged through funerals for non-existent victims, complete with planted news stories and grieving family actors if necessary. A parallel plan involved hijacking an actual civilian flight. The aircraft would be taken over by friendly assets posing as Cuban agents, then flown low over Cuba before being destroyed. The narrative would claim Cuban forces had seized and downed an American plane. Precise timing was emphasized so that U.S. radar and media could capture the incident in real time. Maritime scenarios followed the same logic. The memorandum recommended blowing up a U.S. Navy vessel in Guantanamo Bay or nearby waters, staging the attack to appear as Cuban sabotage or patrol boat aggression. Another variant suggested sinking a boat filled with Cuban refugees off the Florida coast and blaming Castro's forces for the massacre. In each case, the plan required friendly casualties, American or exile lives, to generate authentic outrage. On land, the proposals turned darker. The Joint Chiefs suggested staging terrorist attacks inside the United States itself. Bombs could be detonated in Miami or other Florida cities with evidence planted to implicate Cuban agents. Attacks on Cuban exile communities would be manufactured, then blamed on Castro's intelligence services. Even an incident at Guantanamo base was detailed. U.S. troops would simulate an attack by Cuban forces, complete with casualties and captured enemy weapons. The document explicitly discussed the propaganda value of funerals. Mock funerals for fabricated victims would be held with full media coverage. Grieving widows and children would appear on television. The cumulative emotional weight, the generals calculated, would shift public opinion decisively toward supporting military action. Every scenario included built-in deniability and rapid escalation. The provocations were to be compressed into a short window, days or weeks, so that doubters would not have time to investigate before the invasion was already underway. Supporting documents attached to the memo outlined psychological operations, pre-written press releases, and United Nations talking points designed to portray the United States as the innocent victim of unprovoked communist aggression. The language remained ice-cold and procedural. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban attack on U.S. forces has occurred, one section stated. Another noted that the death of Americans would provide the necessary emotional trigger. There was no hand-wringing, no moral qualification. The focus was solely on effectiveness and plausibility. These were not fringe ideas scribbled by mid-level staff. They carried the signatures of General Lyman Lemnitzer, Chief of Staff of the Army, Admiral George W. Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, General David M. Shoup of the Marine Corps, and the senior officers of the Air Force. The entire top uniformed leadership of the United States endorsed the plan as a legitimate option. To the American public in March 1962, none of this existed. News reports spoke of diplomatic initiatives, naval exercises in the Caribbean, and continued monitoring of the Soviet-backed regime in Havana. Kennedy projected an image of measured leadership after the Bay of Pigs. The Pentagon maintained its public posture of professional restraint. Inside the classified world, however, the proposal represented a profound crossing of a line. America's senior military commanders had formally recommended manufacturing war through the deliberate killing of their own citizens and the systematic deception of the American people. The document treated public opinion not as something to inform, but as something to engineer. The memorandum was now fully formed, a complete operational blueprint for manufactured consent through manufactured atrocity. It only awaited approval higher up the chain. The memorandum did not remain confined to the Pentagon. It moved upward through the formal chain of command with the procedural efficiency of any other high-level military recommendation. General Lyman Lemnitzer, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, signed the document on behalf of the entire Chiefs of Staff and forwarded it directly to Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara. This was standard protocol. The Secretary of Defense served as the civilian bridge between the uniformed military and the White House. McNamara, a former president of Ford Motor Company, known for his systems analysis approach and iron control over the Pentagon, received the 15-page proposal in mid-March 1962. At that moment, McNamara was the central figure overseeing Operation Mongoose. He chaired high-level interagency meetings that included CIA Director John McCone, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and representatives from the State Department. The Northwoods Memorandum was presented within this broader planning process. It was not hidden from civilian leadership. It was offered as a serious operational option for generating the pretext necessary for invasion. Exactly how McNamara reacted in writing remains partially obscured by classification, but the document's path did not stop at his desk. It entered the orbit of the highest national security decision-making. President Kennedy had created the Special Group, Augmented, specifically to manage Cuba policy after the Bay of Pigs. This group, which included the president's brother, reviewed aggressive options against Castro on a regular basis. The proposal arrived at a delicate political moment. Kennedy was still recovering from the Bay of Pigs humiliation. He had publicly committed to a policy of containment rather than outright invasion. At the same time, pressure from hardliners in the military and intelligence community was intense. The Joint Chiefs believed time was running out. Castro was consolidating power and strengthening ties with the Soviet Union. The chain of command functioned exactly as designed. The uniformed military have developed the plan. The Secretary of Defense reviewed it. It was then available for presidential consideration. This was not a rogue operation. It was policy recommendation at the highest level of the United States government, complete with signatures, appendices, and implementation timelines. What made the process remarkable was the complete absence of any apparent moral or legal hesitation in the originating document. The Joint Chiefs presented the idea of manufacturing American casualties as a legitimate strategic tool. The assumption underlying the memo was clear. If the end, removal of Castro, justified the means, then deception of the American public and the deliberate sacrifice of American lives were acceptable costs. Civilian leadership now faced a stark choice. Would they authorize or reject a plan that treated the consent of the governed as something to be manufactured rather than earned? The memorandum had completed its journey from the drafting tables of the Joint Chiefs to the highest reaches of executive power. Its fate would be decided in the White House, and that decision, when it came, would be swift, quiet, and definitive. President John F. Kennedy rejected the core recommendations of the Northwoods Memorandum. Exactly when and how the final decision was delivered remains one of the few procedural details still partially shielded by classification, but the outcome was unmistakable. The full-scale invasion plan built around manufactured provocations was turned down. The March 13 memorandum was not approved. No false flag operations of the kind proposed were ever executed. The document was quietly archived. Kennedy's reasoning, reconstructed from the broader policy context and later accounts of those present, centered on two concerns. First, he remained deeply wary after the Bay of Pigs disaster. Another failed or manipulated operation risked further damaging American credibility and his own presidency. Second, the president understood the domestic political danger. If any element of such a deception were exposed, the backlash would be catastrophic. Staging attacks on Americans to justify war crossed a line that civilian leadership was unwilling to cross, at least in this instance. In the weeks following the proposal, the tone at the highest levels began to shift. By October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis would erupt, forcing Kennedy and Khrushchev into direct confrontation. The resolution of that crisis, the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade, effectively closed the immediate window for any Northwoods-style invasion pretext. The military's aggressive timetable was overtaken by nuclear diplomacy. The professional consequences for the plan's primary advocate were swift but discreet. General Lyman Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs ended in 1962. Kennedy did not reappoint him. Lemnitzer was instead assigned as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, a prestigious post, but one that removed him from direct influence over Cuba policy. The other chiefs remained in place, but the clear signal had been sent. The most extreme options were off the table. Operation Mongoose itself continued in modified form. Sabotage, assassination plots against Castro, and harassment operations persisted through 1962 and into 1963. But the grand false flag architecture proposed in the Northwoods Memorandum was shelved. No passenger planes were swapped with drones. No American ships were deliberately sunk in Guantanamo Harbor. No staged terrorist attacks were carried out on U.S. soil. The rejection was not accompanied by any public statement. The American people were never told that their military leadership had formally recommended killing Americans to manufacture support for war. The memorandum simply disappeared into the classified system. It would remain there, untouched and unmentioned, for the next 35 years. Behind the scenes, the episode revealed the structural tension at the heart of Cold War decision-making. The uniformed military, trained to think in terms of maximum effectiveness and acceptable losses, had proposed a solution that treated public consent as an engineering problem. Civilian leadership, ultimately accountable to voters, drew a different line. In this case, the civilians prevailed. The machinery had produced its most radical recommendation. The president had said no, but the document itself, bearing the signatures of America's highest generals, continued to exist in the vaults, a time capsule of how far some were willing to go when they believed the stakes justified any means. Its rediscovery would come only after the last participants had left power, when a new generation of archivists began opening files that had been sealed since the Kennedy era. For more than 3 decades, Operation Northwoods existed only in the deepest vaults of the U.S. national security apparatus. The 15-page memorandum and its appendices remained classified at the highest level, unknown even to most senior officials who succeeded the original players. The public narrative through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s stayed firmly on the official track. Kennedy had shown restraint during the missile crisis. Successive administrations, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, maintained the posture that the United States had responded to real Cuban and Soviet threats with measured strength, never crossing into outright fabrication. Textbooks, documentaries, and congressional histories presented the Cuba policy of the early 1960s as a tense but rational chapter of the Cold War. No hint surfaced of a formal Pentagon proposal to manufacture the very provocations it claimed to fear. Inside the system, the document was simply filed away. As new crises arose, Vietnam détente, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Northwoods became ancient history, an unexecuted contingency from a more paranoid era. The Joint Chiefs who signed it retired and died. McNamara moved on to the World Bank. The Kennedy White House records were gradually opened under normal presidential library schedules, but the most explosive Cuba files remained tightly held. The slow unearthing began in the mid-1990s, driven by an unlikely bureaucratic process. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, mandating the release of all government documents related to the 1963 assassination. The Assassination Records Review Board, ARB, an independent agency created by the law, gained broad authority to declassify millions of pages across multiple agencies. In 1997, while reviewing Pentagon and Joint Chiefs files for any assassination-related material, ARB staff discovered the Northwoods Memorandum. It had no direct connection to Kennedy's death, but it fell within the broad scope of Cuba policy documents from 1962. The board reviewed the content, recognized its historic significance, and voted for full declassification. On November 18, 1997, the 15-page document was quietly released as part of a large batch of JFK-related records. At first, it received almost no public attention. The mainstream press barely noticed. A handful of researchers and historians who monitored the ARB releases were the first to read the chilling language in full. The real public emergence came in 2001. The National Security Archive, a nonprofit research group at George Washington University, posted the complete memorandum online along with supporting documents. For the first time, ordinary Americans could read the exact words signed by the Joint Chiefs. Proposals for hijacked airliners, staged terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, fake funerals, and the calculated sacrifice of American lives. The revelation landed with delayed but growing force. Independent journalists, historians, and researchers began writing about it. The document's bureaucratic tone made its content even more disturbing. This was not the ranting of extremists, it was calm, numbered, signed military planning. Still, the story never achieved the explosive mainstream attention many expected. It competed with 9/11, the War on Terror, and later crises. Yet within alternative history circles and serious national security scholarship, Northwoods became a landmark case study, the clearest documented example of senior U.S. military leaders formally recommending the deliberate deception of the American people through manufactured atrocities. The declassification process itself proved procedural and slow, exactly as the classification system was designed to be. 35 years passed between the signing of the memo and its public release. By then, most of the principal actors were dead. The political impact was diffused across decades. The machinery of secrecy had done its job. It delayed accountability until the moment when accountability could no longer threaten the institutions involved. The document survived. The proposal it contained never left the planning stage. But its existence, once revealed, raised a permanent question about how far power is willing to go when it believes the public cannot be trusted with the truth. The document finally broke into daylight between 1997 and 2001, but the revelation arrived in slow, bureaucratic waves rather than a single explosive moment. In late 1997, as part of the Assassination Records Review Board's mandated releases, the full 15-page Northwoods memorandum was declassified and quietly placed into the National Archives. For several years, it sat largely unnoticed among hundreds of thousands of other JFK-era files. Most mainstream outlets missed it entirely. A small circle of researchers who tracked the ARB releases were the first to read the signatures, the proposals, and the cold language recommending the deaths of Americans as a legitimate pretext for war. The broader public awakening came in 2001. The National Security Archive at George Washington University obtained high-quality scans and published the complete memorandum on its website, along with explanatory context and supporting Mongoose documents. For the first time, anyone with an internet connection could read the exact words signed by the chairman and every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The reaction was immediate in certain circles and muted in others. Independent journalists and historians described it as one of the most disturbing declassifications of the entire Cold War. The document's bureaucratic tone, its calm, numbered, procedural style, made the content more shocking than any sensational headline could. This was not speculation. It was official Pentagon planning, complete with cost-benefit logic for manufacturing American casualties. Major newspapers ran cautious stories. Some framed Northwoods as an example of overzealous military planning that was rightly rejected. Others treated it as a historical curiosity from a more dangerous time. Cable news gave it brief segments, yet the story never dominated the mainstream cycle. It competed with the aftermath of the 2000 election, the beginning of the War on Terror, and the intense focus on new threats. The full implications settled more deeply in books, documentaries, and academic circles over the following years. What made the revelation especially powerful was the primary source itself. Readers could see the proposals in black and white. Drone aircraft swaps, staged funerals, attacks on Guantanamo, terrorist incidents on U.S. soil. The signatures were unmistakable. The classification markings were real. There was no credible way to dismiss the document as forgery or exaggeration. The Pentagon and National Archives had released it themselves. Public discourse split along familiar lines. Some saw Northwoods as proof that elements inside the U.S. government had been willing to cross the ultimate line, killing their own to achieve policy goals. Others emphasized that the plan was rejected by civilian leadership and never implemented, arguing it demonstrated the system's built-in checks rather than its failures. Historians placed it in context, a period of genuine fear over Soviet missiles in Cuba and the recent humiliation at the Bay of Pigs. Inside the national security community, the document was largely met with institutional silence. No formal Pentagon review or apology was issued. The episode was treated as an historical anomaly from a bygone era of heightened Cold War tension. The machinery that produced the memo had long since moved on to new doctrines and new threats. By the early 2000s, Operation Northwoods had become a permanent reference point in discussions about government secrecy, false flags, and the limits of military power. It joined a short list of fully declassified documents that show how far senior officials were once willing to go. The proposal was never executed, but its existence could no longer be denied. The slow procedural unearthing, 35 years from signature to public release, demonstrated both the strength and the fragility of the classification system. It could hide explosive truths for decades, but it could not erase them forever. The final act of the story belonged not to the generals who signed the memo, nor to the president who rejected it, but to the archivists and researchers who forced the vaults open long after the players had left the stage. The proposal was never implemented. The aircraft were never swapped. No American cities were bombed by their own military. No funerals were staged for fabricated victims. Operation Northwoods remained a rejected memorandum, locked away for 35 years before the declassification machinery finally dragged it into the light. In the decades that followed its 1997-2001 release, the document became a quiet but enduring reference point in American historical memory. It did not spark congressional investigations or criminal inquiries. Those avenues had long since closed. No surviving participants were compelled to testify under oath about their intentions. The Pentagon issued no formal statements of regret. The episode simply entered the permanent record as one of the most explicit examples of how senior military leadership could rationalize the deliberate deception and potential sacrifice of American citizens in pursuit of strategic objectives. What really happened? On March 13, 1962, the chairman and every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff formally recommended a series of false flag operations, including the hijacking and destruction of passenger planes, the bombing of U.S. cities, attacks on American military bases, and the staging of funerals for mock victims, all designed to be blamed on Cuba in order to manufacture public support for a full-scale invasion. The plan was presented through proper channels to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and reached the Kennedy White House. It was rejected. The document itself survived in classified files until independent review boards forced its release. What was the public told at the time? Americans were told that their government was exercising restraint and pursuing diplomatic solutions after the Bay of Pigs failure. The Kennedy administration projected an image of measured leadership facing a dangerous but containable communist threat 90 miles from Florida. No hint was ever given that the nation's highest military officers had proposed killing Americans to create a pretext for war. What evidence contradicts the official narrative? The original 15-page top-secret memorandum itself, complete with signatures, operational details, and procedural language. Released by the Assassination Records Review Board in 1997 and published in full by the National Security Archive in 2001. The document is primary source material, not allegation, not secondhand account, but the Pentagon's own planning paper. What mechanisms allowed the truth to stay hidden for so long? Rigid classification at the highest level, compartmentalization within the national security apparatus, the passage of decades until mandatory declassification laws applied, and the absence of any public whistleblower at the time. The system was designed to protect sensitive planning. In this case, it also protected ideas that would have been politically toxic if revealed while the participants still held power. What should we learn from this case today? Operation Northwoods demonstrates that even in a constitutional republic with civilian control of the military, senior officers can reach a point where they view the consent of the American people as an obstacle to be engineered rather than a principle to be respected. The plan was stopped not by internal moral objection within the military chain, but by civilian leadership exercising its authority. That check worked in 1962. The document's survival reminds us that such checks are not automatic. They depend on individuals willing to say no, and on systems that eventually force secrets into the open. In an era of advanced technology, persistent classification, and renewed great power competition, the logic that produced Northwoods has not disappeared. It has simply found new tools and new justifications. The proposal stands as a permanent warning etched into the declassified record. When institutions become convinced that the stakes are existential, the temptation to manufacture reality rather than persuade the public can become overwhelming. The American system ultimately rejected this particular path, but the fact that the path was professionally mapped, signed, and presented at the highest level should serve as a lasting reminder. Secrecy is necessary in intelligence and defense. Unchecked secrecy, however, can incubate ideas that are fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance. The memorandum lies in the archives now. Its signatures are still legible, its language remains ice-cold, and its central question continues to echo whenever governments claim they must deceive the people in order to protect them. How far is too far?